space, lots of you that have been using the Bluecoat as printmakers for years and years and years and years and years. And so from the left to the right, may I introduce Jason Hicklin,
Hello.
Alistair Tucker,
Hi.
and Norman Ackroyd, and of course Brian, and I'll get to sit down.
When you see all the work together, there's a real sense of learning from each other, and there's a lot of similarities sort of in the prints, although they're very distinct in their own right. If you look at them together in terms of landscape and technique, there's a lot of similarities. Could you perhaps talk that through as to...
I think that is a very interesting point. I was a very lucky fellow when I was a young man, because when I went to Leeds College of Art, there was a man there called Norman Webster, who was a great etching craftsman in the grammar of the business. He knew how to make an ink, he knew how to make a ground, he knew how to etch a plate precisely, but he didn't restrict us, and he wasn't a dogmatic tutor. He gave me complete freedom, which was utterly ridiculous, really, for him. But I was incredibly grateful for that, to be taught initially, my first immersion into etching, to be by somebody who really knew the grammar and craftsmanship of it. He wasn't some fly-by-night, let's make tricky things. He knew the history and he knew everything. That was so crucial. And then, of course, I went on and made a great friendship with Anthony Gross, who I think was one of the great etchers of the 20th century, and Julian Trevelyan, who was a great benefactor. And then I ended up teaching with Merlin Evans, one of the great Mezzotintas. So I was a very lucky fellow when I was a young man. You know, I was taken on to teach at the Central School of Arts and Crafts when I was only 26, you know, with Gertrude Hermes, Merlin Evans, all these people. You know, I mean, it's a lot of life is about luck, you know, and I just had, had these relationships with these people. So continuity and handing it on, and they handed so much on to me, and it gave me this incredibly powerful feeling of responsibility to hand things on to other people, you know. So the teaching is not a dogmatic teaching. The teaching is just a kind of, it's a responsibility to hand things on and with continuity. So that maybe answers your question.
Okay, what about the others?
Well, carrying on from what Norman just said, I consider myself, just as Norman said, to be very fortunate. I was very, very fortunate. I was at college in London, struggling on a painting degree, and I went into the central etching room and met Norman, who was teaching there, taught me to etch, and from the very first minute I realised that it was almost as if the etching was something I'd forgotten rather than something I was learning. I somehow was able to pick it up very quickly from Norman, and he, being a great teacher he is, I was able to sort of take on what Norman talked about, that idea of a responsibility, of having to learn something inside out. And Norman did that for me. He took it, I realised there was someone there who took this business very seriously. He wasn't there to fill in the time, he wasn't there to mess about with it. He took it dead seriously. He had a great practice and a great business of his own, and he made great images. And to be part and to be taught by someone like that was really important at the age I met Norman. And it made complete sense of the reason I was at art school. And I felt I was falling into some sort of sacred tradition of some sort. And being taught by Norman and working for Norman afterwards has been a tremendously important part for me in my life, really, because it's given me a real focus. And it's the one thing, the etching is something I feel I can learn, and I'm sort of still learning a lot about how to etch. And it's down to Norman and that tradition of etching I'm tremendously grateful for. And I guess that's it, really.
Well, I think that, I mean, my background's slightly different in that I trained as a sculptor in Bristol, and worked for quite a long time with sheets of steel, brass, bronze, and actually constructed imagery out of metal. I moved on from that, not necessarily because I wasn't enjoying it, but I moved on and found myself making landscapes. The work had often, in a sculptural way, been about landscapes. I found myself going back to drawing and in going back to drawing, found myself making prints. And it was at that point that when I was really beginning to explore that idea of making prints and of working again with metal, but rather than in a three-dimensional way on a two-dimensional scale, I was fortunate to meet Jason. And in the context of being a teacher, so this theme of education and of passing something on continues. I was head of art at a school where Jason's children were going and still go. I've moved on from there latterly, but Jason really, at that point we were only doing quite simple dry point. Jason donated, and this is the note of commitment really from etchers and in how they believe wholeheartedly in the process, donated work to the school to enable the school to set up an etching studio. And I think in that process, some of the initial work I'd done on degree in etching returned, and Jason has been quite important in that process of guiding me. And I continue to do that, having set up a second etching studio now in Chester, to pass that on to children, usually 16 to 18-year-olds, just believing in the process. And I think for me it's not the process itself is full of craft. It's full of rules and regulations that you need to begin to understand so that you can break them, but also to be able to make things. It operates and governs through rules and principles that people like Goya and Rembrandt were laying down hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And for me, when I'm struggling in painting and when I'm struggling in drawing, to be able to return to that process where there are rules and regulations which don't exist so much in painting anymore or in sculpture, it gives me something to fight against, something to work with. I think that's
It's interesting that you mentioned rules and regulations, because one thing that comes across in looking at all your work is that great spontaneity. It's almost as if you're drawing with print. And can you say a bit about that, how you get that? I mean, it's obviously years and years of practice, but is it a different approach that you have to drawing as you have to when it comes to making the plate?
Taking on from, before we go on to that, from what you said, that I've had many approaches over the years to actually write a book on the technique of etching by various publishers and things. I've always turned it down, and I've turned it down for very personal reasons, is that I think that some things cannot be taught by words or film or anything. They can only be taught by personal contact. And all my best etching teaching was taught by somebody actually watching somebody's hands move. There is a kind of thing of craftsmanship which can only be done person to person. It can't be done through a book. I mean, you can get all sorts of recipes and things like that through a book, but to watch it. And so I've always actually been against that kind of thing. And so I've never ever, and never ever will, make a book on etching techniques. And I think that it's up to the people of your age to actually hand it on, get somebody at the side of you, show them how to do it, show them how to set a press, show them how to set the pressure, show them how to damp paper perfectly, how to mix certain acids. You do, and to watch you actually somebody doing it by hand. Certain things need to be communicated in a human way still, and always will be, and I've always believed strong, and etching, because it goes back so far, etching will always be one of those techniques. I'm not being dogmatic about this. It is the business. You know, how you mix an ink, the way your hand moves, how you grind it, all that kind of thing, the coup de main, all right, has got to be handed on by hand. All right.
And do you still teach?
Very, very occasionally, only in places that do etching properly. This year I've done a couple of visits, which has been more than last year when I didn't do any. But I go to Galway because when Galway say, will you come over, I say only if you hire a boat and go out to the Aran Islands and we'll work on the boat. And I do things like that, but I don't really.
Not in
anymore.
your studio, you don't teach?
I don't do things in my studio. I have occasional, I invite an artist to come in and make an etching just on a socially. I've just had Nigel Hall, the sculptor, has come in and worked with my assistants. And we had last year, Jason came down and helped me when we had, who did we have last year?
Ian McKeever.
Ian McKeever, who did some absolutely beautiful plates, didn't he?
Stunners, absolute stunners.
Absolutely stunning. And he came down with the two architects, the president of the Royal Academy, Nick Grimshaw, who did the Eden Project. He came, and Chris Wilkinson, who did the Blinking Eye Bridge. I liked the idea of making etchings by architects. So and then I thought, well, two architects, they actually need a real painter, so Ian McKeever. And we had a great fun.
It was fantastic.
And and sometimes I had these little etching parties. And the previous one was
Xander Rhodes.
We had Xander Rhodes with John Main, the stone carver, and Fred Cumin, the painter, and we had those for a party. But I only do it once every 2 years, and it's just for fun. And it's nice fun, though.
It's fantastic. You learn a lot when you're working with, say, someone like Ian McKeever, who doesn't normally etch, and then he brings his problems to it and his questions of the medium. And to work alongside someone like that really opens your eyes, and you learn so much from
I can
your teaching
imagine.
experience.
It'd be so lucky to be able to do something like that anyway.
I'd always wanted to. I think Nigel Hall is one of the great elegant sculptors. I don't know whether you know Nigel Hall's work. He's a fellow academician, and I've always said to Nigel, if ever you want to make an etching, just let me know and we'll see if we can fit you in. And he's got a big retrospective at the Yorkshire Sculpture Park at present, and he said I'd love to make a couple of etchings to go with that exhibition. And he came and absolutely, I knew he'd make some beautiful etchings.
Well, my name is Frida McKittrick, and I would like to make some beautiful etchings in your studio.
and it's just a kind of fun thing I do with the studio, it's just a nice thing to do. I don't do it for any kind of, it's, and I've got 2 or 3 other people lined up for another one, maybe at the end of the year, just for fun.
And the other way around and do some sculpture.
Well, I do have standing invitations to make sculpture, that's interesting. Etching is an incredibly social thing because it depends on on human interaction in terms of communicating ideas. I'll tell you somebody who really wants to make some etchings with me. It's not quite in your league, in your area. Is Quentin Blake is going to come round and make some etchings. Now, who do I put Quentin Blake with? But Quentin's wonderful, and of course those beautiful loose drawings of his. I might get a bit of discipline into. No, I think he's terrific. I love Quentin, and I think he would come round, and do something. He wants to anyway, so you just sound it out. But this is just, we spend all our time in our studios just working, like monks on our own. It's wonderful to do social things now and again like this. And playing cricket.
You still go out and work outside with your plates and acids?
Oh yes, all the time.
Yeah. Is it easy to do this?
I find it quite easy. Yes. It's you've got to be very careful. You've got to have common sense because you need very strong acids and you're transporting them, and you can't go on public transport because that's illegal. But you can do that, but I use a lot of sugar lift, which isn't illegal, and you can take that on a plane and everything, and you can get the first marks onto the plate. Isn't that right?
Absolutely.
Do you reverse the image at all when you go out to do a recognisable place?
Oh yeah, you take a mirror.
Yeah, right.
And you take an assistant to hold the mirror.
I find a rock works quite well.
Well, I've seen some where the image hasn't been reversed, and you can see that it's not the place it really is.
You've just got to make your mind up whether you want to reverse it or not. I mean, I'm not really doing literal place. I mean, I'm doing trying to get the feeling of the place, and therefore you maybe don't need to put it straight back.
Yeah.
A lot of the time I work in watercolour.
Peter?
Zinc or copper or both?
Well, I'm using zinc primarily because I find it much quicker to etch than copper, and I don't make large enough editions to need to steel face prints. So I like working with nitric as well, but it's also what's handed on to you, and Jason works primarily with zinc.
I work in zinc.
So you tend to do what's handed on, don't you, really? And I've done some work with copper, and copper's very, very nice. It is more expensive, which makes a difference. Yeah.
The etchings in Owen's exhibition, there's lovely sort of silvery grey tones on the images. Do you use a special ink, or do you extend the ink? It doesn't seem...
Which particular images are you talking about?
It's
The very big one?
the very big one.
Yeah, well that's printed with an etching ink made out of graphite.
All right. So
You don't need to make an etching ink out of black pigments. So it's a graphite etching ink. It's you can print an etching. The golden rule is that is a very interesting thing you said. You learn the rules so you can break them. A very interesting point. And the golden rule is there are no golden rules. There are rules, but no golden rules. And so you can really do anything, but you've got to learn the grammar before you can break it. Really, I think. So you understand what you're dealing with, and the morality and the integrity of a medium is absolutely crucial. And then you can break it only when you understand it. You can't break it because you can't be bothered to learn about it. That is sloppy stuff.
Question here.
Would you say, you mentioned that you'd only go to a place where they do proper etching and you don't work with zinc. Would you say that changing approaches and landscape in printmaking is changing how we print and how much printmaking is being passed on to people?
There are all sorts of new developments which are an addition to what we already have. They're not a replacement. It really is wonderful because it opens up all sorts of new directions. The trouble is that a lot of financial people who run some art schools think because this is cheaper and sets out to replace something, that it does replace something. And in fact, that's the problem when you get people who know about money and don't know about art actually being in charge of the purse strings in certain places. They're going to cause untold damage.
So what happens to printmaking when those people are in charge? Do you think this is going to turn around like photography will turn around?
I think I think there's room for both, but the thing that interests me about etching is its corrosive nature and the toxicity of it all. It's about corrosion, and I don't. So and that corrosion is controlled and contained, and as long as you teach people how to use that properly, how to deal with the fumes, how to handle the acid, where to put it, it's safe and it's fine to use. It's when it's taught badly and it's sort of free for all that accidents will happen. And as long as you teach people properly, there shouldn't be any problem at all. And you shouldn't be sort of swimming in the acid or have your hands in there for hours. You're literally touching it, it's in and you're out. It's so I think there's room for teaching it well, and if it's taught well, toxic etching is
Presumably from the other end, bringing this into schools, you've got more scope to bring etching into schools nowadays than you did.
Why have you got more etching? I mean, I've been invited to several schools, and they've got they're etching with nitric acid and chloride of iron in schools.
Well, I've just got experienced a lot of schools who actually wouldn't have touched etching before, but when you tell them you can use ferric and you can use different things, and you don't have the widespread, they're more open to it. I'm a nitric etcher, so I try and keep it in as much as possible.
Yeah,
But
I mean,
do
ferric
find
chloride
schools
is not toxic if you actually, behave sensibly with it. I mean, nitric can be a real problem with kids. I mean, we know that. But you get that the corrosive thing. That great quote of William Blake, and I don't know whether I can remember it. Does man have a soul from separate from this? I will attempt to do in the infernal method with corrosives. And he's going to etch the vision of heaven and hell, and he's going to do it with corrosives in metal, which in heaven is salutary.
And corrosion is thought of corrosion is a very negative thing to do. You're actually taking away something. I've always been fascinated by the way of taking away to get a positive. I mean, I've never really got over that thought of corroding to get a positive, and that's something that's why it's so important.
Yeah.
It's the thing like Michelangelo's David. He didn't phone up. He sent a courier. Will you send me this big block of marble from Carrara? And this big block of marble comes, and it's a big rough block, and he's in there is David, if I can only find him. Now you get that with a beautiful piece of copper, mirror finished copper. You're sitting there, and you think you've got, the west of the Dingle Peninsula and how it goes down to the Skellig Front. It's in there. All you got to do is use acid to find it. I mean, that's wonderful feeling of it's all existing. It's all there. All you got to do is find it. And you do it with acid, or you do it with the chisel, and that it's very similar to that kind of stuff. I love that. I just think that is wonderful stuff.
There's a lovely quote actually moving on from that as to what you, when you corrode, what you are doing. A lovely quote from Anthony Welsh that you were talking about earlier, who wrote that etching is, to paraphrase, etching is about what you do with the white. It's what you leave. And this lovely idea of that it's this white space. You're always dealing with that white space because everything you do on a plate if you're talking about etching as an intaglio mark, it goes below the surface. So you are always saving that white, and there's a nice quote in the book there from Anthony Welsh just about saving that white. The
white's probably more important than the black.
Absolutely.
And when I first met him, he came to visit the Royal College as an external tutor, just for one visit. And I'd been told when I was in Leeds, as a very young student, that the greatest living etcher was Anthony Gray. I couldn't believe that I was going to meet this guy, And he took an instant like, it was lovely. We really got on very well. And he was absolutely adamant that Mantegna was the greatest ever printmaker in the history of printmaking. Mantegna. So off I went to the British Museum, to see Mantegna. It was the first time I'd been to the print room. But then I saw Hopper, and that wonderful afternoon wind etching of Hopper, of the girl kneeling on the bed and the curtains blowing in through the window. It's 95% white paper, It's absolute, and then knowing what Tony said about the white being more important than the black, and how he talked to me about that. I mean, that's just exactly right. Yeah. And I've always, it's the white paper, and therefore the white paper is crucial. Yeah. The colour of paper you print on, and the colour of the black ink, because it's all black and white etching is all about colour.
I think I've heard a quote from you actually saying, "My colour is black." Is it something like that?
Probably. It's very. I'm not going to deny it.
Can I ask you two in particular to talk about the relationship between your sketchbooks and your work? Perhaps something about the habit of going out and gathering reference material and how that relates and how closely it relates. And if you're not making plates in situ, then how you get that working sketchbook to remain lively on the plate.
I think the sketchbooks to me are the most important things I make. they always have been crucial to my working process. And I guess with the etchings at the moment, what I've always wanted to do with etching is to get as close as I can to what I'm making in my sketchbooks. And that's taken a long while. I feel at the moment I'm just about sort of finding my way into how to recreate what I create in sketchbooks. But if I didn't have the sketchbooks, there wouldn't be any work. It all comes from the walks I do, the marks I make on the paper, the plates I take with me. I always start my plates with a soft ground drawing on site. So then I come back to the studio, proof the soft ground, see what I have, and then work on them in the studio from the sketchbooks. I don't use anything, no photographs or anything. So the sketchbooks are what it's all about, really. All the prints you see, or any paintings I make. It's the sketchbooks run deep.
Would you like to talk a bit about the process of gathering material for these Irish etchings and the way that the plate a day thing?
Yeah, there's two sets of etchings, one in Alwyn's and a set in the folio here. I did 2 teaching residencies in North West Ireland in County Donegal. And the set up at Alwyn's at the moment, I was there for 16 days. So every day I was teaching every evening, so during the morning I'd walk, make drawings on the plate, teach in the evening, and then when everyone had left the studio I'd then start proofing the plate and aquatinting and taking proofs and working on the plate. So all night, or through into the night, I'd work on a plate. And my aim was that every day I was there, a plate would be made. And those plates would be the 16-day walk, which I would have done around the Donegal coast. And so in that sense, the sketchbooks were all I had, as well as these plates. And that rhythm of walking and of etching and of teaching became a really exciting production period for me, because I like that pace and I like the rush. And I like the fact that not one of those plates was going to be allowed to get away from me. I would, if it stayed up all night, I would get that plate to work. And I enjoy that freshness of etching. I enjoy the chase, as it were.
Did you enjoy the disciplined schedule?
Yes.
Yeah. I like that sometimes. It's very good. Yeah.
And I think etching though suits that perfectly. There is a discipline we've already mentioned of the studio, and for me, I needed that in my making art drawing process. I needed that, and so it's sort of the same. I do need rhythms, and I do need deadlines all the time, so they don't get made.
So how would you, Alistair, try and create that momentum and that flow?
Well, yeah, well, I think it's interesting just to, that the idea of the way in which Jason's working and the discipline involved there. For me, when I'm one of the, I do produce work outside, sometimes with sugar lifters, as Norman was talking about, and sometimes in soft ground, and sometimes in hard ground too. But I would do probably more drawing, and what I'm doing, I think, probably really just as a matter of fitting in with a family life and being away. Sometimes you're away on holiday. I tend to get up early in the morning, so I'm out first thing in the morning. The light's just coming up. It's the best time in the morning to experience a landscape, I think, and also late at night, just before dusk, I'm out again. Kids are in bed, so they're either asleep or they're in bed, and you're able to have a bit of holiday and be a father as well as actually doing some work. So there's a discipline there of getting up early, of going out again, and sometimes that's something that you've got to put yourself into. And for me, the actual experience of being outside and of drawing and of being in front of that landscape and experiencing it for yourself is something absolutely essential. If you're not there, how do you know what's going on? It's always different. It's always a surprise, and the battle always is to keep that kind of. The challenge is to translate what you've seen, what you've experienced, what you've drawn back onto a plate, which very often, because of its nature, it's metal, it's hard, it resists all the time. You've got that battle, that dialogue with something that's, well,
Yeah, I
harder than
agree.
anything, and so trying to keep that freshness of being outside is difficult. I mean, I'm also reminded of I'm a great fan of Fred Williams, the Australian painter, who trained in England at he might have even been at St Martin's actually, but he trained in this country. Did a number of things based more like the Sickert's sort of entertaining halls. Went back to Australia, and somebody said to him, "What are you going to do now, Fred?" And he said, "I'm going to draw. I'm going to draw the landscape." And somebody said to him, "Well, everybody does that." And he said, "I'm just going to draw the landscape." In England, we have a huge wealth and history of fantastic landscape painting. And yet, if you were to sum up what is the British Isles about, for me, it is the landscape and the weather. I don't think it is anything else. You only have to drive along the motorway, and the weather changes from one place to the next dramatically. I'm always struck by the presence and of being outside. This country for me isn't about anything else.
We have a question here first.
Following on from that, I had the good fortune to spend 3 weeks on Herta in
Did you?
1958.
Yeah.
And your front cover of the catalogue captures a scene that no digital camera could do. Turner would have been proud of. You must have been close to hypothermia.
The big problem was the stink of rotten fish. the sheer smell of when you get near to one of those gannatories, it's just so nauseous.
Right.
And the row, it's just, you think, well, I could never actually put this up.
And did you do it from
a
Royal
small
Isle-
boat. From a boat.
Oh, from a boat, right.
The drawings were from a boat. I didn't take the plate out there. It was too. But it's a magical place. You were on Herta. What were you doing on Herta?
We were the first group to go on with the Scottish National Trust to
You were.
prepare the village.
And you prepared the first two houses, didn't you, to make them habitable? That was before the army came, was it?
They just arrived.
They
Yes.
just arrived, and they were down by the old
We
manse.
were bobbing about on the bay waiting to land while they faffed about.
It's the most spectacular place.
Amazing. Actually.
And those sea
But
steps.
have you done a series of etches of it?
I did a whole
Or was
book called St Kilda, the Furthest Land.
Oh, right.
A set of 12 or 14 etchings of St Kilda,
Excellent.
1989, small etchings. A lot of them are in the, what's the gallery in Glasgow? One of the public galleries in Glasgow, the one down in the park.
Ontario.
Yes, yeah.
And still available.
The book is not available, it's all gone, yeah. But you can see them in various places.
We have a question up there.
My question is actually following on from that. I wanted to ask you about landscape and what especially inspired you. Do you know as soon as you get somewhere? Is it the weather mixture?
I read a lot. I mean, I wanted to go to St Kilda for about 10-15 years before I actually made it, because of just the history of human habitation and human adversity, and on the edge of Europe. I just find it absolutely fascinating. Last July, I went out to the most westerly habitation of the whole of Europe, which is on a lighthouse rock called the Terrat, off the Dingle Peninsula, right out in the Atlantic. I had always wanted to go Atlantic side of it, because that was what the point that the emigrants who left after the famine was the last point of their native land that they would see as it disappeared over the horizon. There's something about that kind of human contact with the land, which my imagination goes. I always wanted to go to the Atlantic side of the Terrat, and I made it last July for the first time. And so it's to do with that, and I read an enormous amount about these things, books by Tim Robinson, books by Seamus Heaney, books on Inishowen, Malin, Hebrides, all this kind of thing. I devour whenever I see it, it inspires me to want to go. And I've already established a contact with a boatman who's going to take me to Innistrahul and Tory Island off the North Donegal coast, and we're working out. I'm working out a trip for a specific time in July or August to actually hire him for 3 or 4 days and do that whole top bit, you know. And then I'm going to go from Barra and up the Hebrides the year after. The secret is to always have something planned 2 or 3 years ahead.
Alistair and Jason, is that something that you share, that very elemental sort of relationship with the landscape?
Yeah, I think for me, the more I've realised, the more I do, it's more about the sea for me. I'm from Wolverhampton, and landlocked. The sea, I didn't see the sea until I was about 17, something like that, and because we'd never been anywhere. And so it was always seemed very exotic and very exciting to go. And the first time I saw the sea, something sort of clicked. I thought, this is an escape. And ever since the work, I think, it is becoming more about not so much the land, it's about the sea and the sort of the way the two interact, and the time I can spend on a boat is important. But not so much drawing the land at the moment, but drawing the sea, and it's that movement and that interaction and the sort of corrosive nature and the erosion of the sea I'm interested in. But it's always just been the exotic for me.
Which sea was it you saw first?
Real Northwest. I've seen it on TV. I'm going to go back and do an etch. But I do. Yeah, it's important. And at the moment, I'm getting more interested. I'm spending more and more time in Donegal because we're setting up. I'm involved in setting up an etching studio right on the coast, just off the bloody Foreland.
Are you?
We've just got the funding through. So it's right on the edge. So I've been back the last 2 years to this teaching residency, and I'm getting more and more interested in this group of people. It's been a gale-tacked area, and their relationship to the sea is so different to what mine ever was. I never had that. And to read up on what they read and the stories they tell, and the fishermen who come in, and I'm just getting more and more ingrained in that community somehow. And so I'm going to be spending more time there and just picking up books they throw at me and saying, have you read this? And then I'll just see where it takes me, really. I'm sort of just going to see what happens.
The bloody Foreland is where, in 1588, the Armada was forced right round the top.
That's right.
And something like 15, they weren't expecting Ireland when they came. And I think 15 of the Armada went on, grounded on bloody Foreland. And I read an article about 100 years after the Armada, in about 1688, the time of James II, where still along that beach were these kind of skeletons of ships coming out of the sand, you know, the frameworks of these Armada galleons. They've all gone now, but 100 years after the Armada, it was a wreck beach. It's a spectacular thing. Yeah.
And all the stories of these islands in Donegal, the interlock, how they all make, there's famous islands where they make poutine, or they make...
Oh, God.
And so after that, when those ships are ground, the stories of all the rum that disappeared off these Armada ships, and all the locals sort of pounced on it and it disappeared into the islands. So I'm fascinated by that area at the moment. So it's the sea, really, that drives me.
But you get poutine in Donegal?
You do, but you have a tap on the door, and you go to, and it's just on the doorstep.
And you ties a bottle.
And you never mention it. You never say thank you for the. They just sort of look at you. so it does appear on your doorstep. But I don't know if anyone's ever tried to drink it, but.
All right.
Can you etch with it?
Yeah, you're inside.
I drunk it.
Oh no!
Alistair, do you want to sort of come?
Well, yeah, I think for me, at the moment, the relationship is between land and sky. Really, I think I'm fascinated by the repetition of particular shapes that I see in the landscape, and the continual sort of V that occurs time and time again when one headland or one mountain comes across another, and the overlapping of those as they go back in space. I say to myself, I'm going to ignore that this time as I go out drawing, deliberately going to not look for it, and find myself drawing something else, and then it appears. And so I suppose I find myself interested more in that relationship between sky, land, and that can be both at the sea but also in the mountains. And I love being on the top of a mountain. I love being up, looking down, and seeing those spaces. So for me, that's the sort of driving force at the moment.
Let's talk a bit about the scale of the prints, because I mean, normally you've got, I think there's 3 large ones in the exhibition, but generally the prints are fairly intimate, and yet you're dealing with something very magisterial, and this sort of very dynamic landscape, and yet it's condensed into the generally quite small paper. I mean, can you perhaps talk about the scale and whether the scale of the print changes the nature of the work you're doing?
It's pure instinct. What do you think? I just think this is a big etching, this is a medium etching, this is a small etching, this is a very tiny etching. I just go by what my instinct tells me. I mean, it's the only thing you can trust anyway.
I'm driven by the sketchbooks at the moment. All my plates that they're done of all series are the exact size as my sketchbooks when they're opened up. And I found myself drawing in these sketchbooks, and I just felt it just feels right somehow. And so the natural progression was to take the etching plates to the exact size and to continue that hand movement. And so at the moment, it's dictated by the size of the sketchbooks.
I mean, on a physical scale, etching is always going to be smaller than painting because you're always limited by the size of your press. And depending on what press you have accessibility to, at home I have a galley press which is 13 inches wide by 39, which is a very small press, so I'm governed quite often by that. I have access at work. I have a larger one, but it's still that it means that you're governed by that scale. I mean, I'm also governed by time, and wanting to be able to finish something in the time that I've got whilst I'm still teaching. So all those kinds of things affect the scale of my work, really. And
was there a question down here early on? Jim, did you have a question?
Yeah, it was
just do this one first.
to wind back a bit. It's I was thinking about sort of personal relationships and your emotions towards your family when you go out working. Because you're trying to sort of balance a number of things like most human beings do. But it's the humanity of sort of because there is with all drawing and painting a lot of associations with Norman, a lot of people matter to you, and I was thinking the sort of family thing that came out warmest in the centre because you're going off with a sense of tenderness and of touch, as the family and children sort of is a beautiful fatherly thing. Does that affect your work? Does it affect how you're feeling when you're working?
Did you get that at the back? Did you hear that?
It's very interesting.
It's a very interesting question, and I think that's more, but that is about who you are as a person. And I don't think I think about it consciously, but I think it's there as a person, maybe. And people often say to me, but there's no humanity in your work. There's no people. There's no reference to humanity. And I think, well, the landscape is often a product of humanity, but it's also, for me, it's sometimes a sense in which the landscape is very much a part of me. I feel I come from that landscape. I feel that it is, there is in some senses for me, it's that there is a reflection of a creator too, and I think that.
Can I reframe it for you, Norman? Yeah. So the idea was sort of, because there's so many associations going on inside you when you're working, which I respect and that delights me. I think that's the thing that really interests me, to be honest with you, is sort of how in touch with you are you with the idea that you are being personally etched by all that information and needing to sort of somehow be true to that, something that's happening inside you as you make each piece of work?
I think that if you go back to, I've got 4 children. They all took me out for lunch last week. They all got together, conspired to take me out for lunch for my 70th birthday, which was really nice, and I had a wonderful time with them. And one thing that I've always felt in terms of the humanity of that is that one of the main things, you set an example to your children about you actually do what you want them to actually, you can't set the wrong example either. You know, I do what I want to do, and sometimes it might appear incredibly selfish. Ultimately, it's not. Do you understand? Ultimately, you do what you have to do, and you've only got one life, and it actually works, really, I think, in terms of they actually understand that, and it's a good thing.
One of the thoughts that came to me, because you have a lot of literary associative stuff going on inside you, do you make a lot of notes about those things that matter to you in relationship to images?
A lot of poetry, it comes back, I actually sticks in my mind like glue. And I was just thinking when you were talking about that wonderful few lines of Yeats, God save me from the men who think with the mind alone. He who sings a lasting song thinks with a marrow bone. And you only get things in your marrow bone through absolute life experience. And I think, and bits of poetry like that. There's the last book of etchings that I did, which was about going out to Inniskilling and things. I used a wonderful poem by Seamus Heaney called Postscript. And so I have a head full of bits and fragments of poetry, and I've always felt like doing a book called Fragments, which fragments of poetry which I can remember, even if they're slightly incorrect, with fragments of etch. You know, just do something that is not trying to set it, just something that's fragmented. It's a lovely idea, and etching is a fragmenting thing, and poetry comes. I don't know, but I've got a head full of rubbish.
I think we had a question at the top there.
Change the subject. 3 etchers, you'll sketch and etch, but then you'll go on and make watercolours and oils. What is the relationship between your etchings and your watercolours and oils? Which borrows from which? Why do you want to go on? Is it a question of size or medium? Question for each of you, if you don't mind.
Symbiotic. It's absolutely crucial that you move from one to the other, because it's a bit like one inspires the other. You walk up the steps with a heavy weight on your shoulders. You take the weight off and you seem to go up the steps twice as quick. So you move. Sometimes you can get so involved in something, that you become it becomes too self-referenced. You've got to actually go to some different stuff to work with every now and then, and then it's very refreshing to get to it. So it's that kind of thing. And I think watercolour and etching for me are incredibly close anyway.
Anthony Grosh, actually, going back to Anthony Grosh, said that an advice to the artist, if you are a painter or if you are a sculptor, do not give up the art of painting or of sculpture to print, because one day you will regret it. And his idea was that through the art of painting and sculpture, you could, I think he described it as touch the depths of the unknown. And I don't think he was saying that you couldn't with etching, but I think that it offered to painters and to sculptors a time in which you could lay down those things and start something else, so that it would bring you back to the act of drawing and painting in a very different way. And sometimes, for me, and I think for these two guys, you get involved more in that process of etching. But I think that one of the sort of most important things is that sense of drawing and of painting. It feeds. It's like the father, the painting and the drawing.
I think it runs, when I'm working on an etching plate, I'm thinking in the same way as I am when I'm working on a canvas or on a watercolour or in my sketchbook. It just doesn't really, I do a set of etchings and I feel like I just need to do some paintings to clear the etching, to get myself out of the etching studio. And often my paintings at the moment start off with me finishing off with the ink that's on the etching slab. I'll start the canvas with, and so that in a way is a direct link from using the same ink, the same smell. I'll take it to the painting studio, see where that's going to go and follow it. But the actual process of making an image, that's what's really important. It's not really important it's a painting or it's an etching or it's a watercolour or it's a drawing. It's just communicating that feeling of movement in the water or something I've seen. It's just that feeling. So it doesn't really matter whether to me it's a painting or an etching. I think and work in the same way. I think.
That's true.
We've got time for a couple more questions. One up there, thank
I
you.
just want to go back to the question of scale. You mentioned that when you're on a small etching, you still capture space, light, the scale of the landscape. But you've also, Norman, done some work which is actually the plates in reality in the street on a bigger scale. How do those relate to the printed work?
It's interesting that the great thing about etching is the stuff that you're working with. You're working with wonderful inks and wonderful papers, but you're working with plates that reflect. And sometimes when you ink a plate up with a beautiful ink, piece of copper or zinc, and you think, I'll print that, but it can't possibly be anywhere near as good as the plate is, you know. And I've always been fascinated by that, and quite a long time ago I thought it would be wonderful to find a permanent way of doing this so that it could be used architecturally, and now I've done probably, I mean, how many have I done, Jason? I'm good. I've done big steel, and I found a way, and some people who can etch it into stainless steel, and then I ink them up, and so I've got these wonderful plates, and I found a way of doing it permanently, so that it's really permanent, and it can go on the outside or inside of buildings. So I've worked for, done things for Lloyds Bank, British Airways, Freshfields, the British Embassy in Moscow, the new British Embassy in Moscow. I'm working on a big door at present, which is based on the southern tip of Windermere in stainless steel. Now, you've got to actually imagine maybe a small image that could make sense. And again, you're going with your instinct that this image could make sense when you read it across the road from that curtain to that curtain as a door 12 foot square as an image, you know. And so you instinctively think it could be.
Is there something about another Yorkshireman who's nearly as well known as you, who's been doing these very large, multiple paintings?
Yes. Yeah.
Is there something about the elderly in Yorkshire?
He told me 2 weeks ago that he's just rented the next building to Tesco so he can do these big paintings and have somewhere to show them. So he's just rented this big place at the side of Tesco in Bridley. But I think that it's just, I think that we actually do think quite similarly in that anything goes, and there are actually no golden rules, and that both of us are 70, and that we're really going to make something of the next decade and really do something really definitive instead of all the rubbish we've done before. And we're both feeling very optimistic about the future.
Okay, I think we have one more question.
Can I just say, back to the definitive one, if you were to die tomorrow and you wanted to be remembered by one piece or one series, what would it be for each of you? Because I know this is about the last question, so what would you leave us with? That really summed up the you of you.
I'm not about to do that. But they might be. What go on.
If I was to die now, the set of etchings I've just finished, which are still pinned on the studio wall, because I think they're the best thing I've done.
Well, I think you always think that. Yeah, I think there is that sense in which when you're involved with something now, you think it's the best thing. And I think it's probably, from my point of view, it's for other people to say what they think is the best thing, and for me to continue working.
Well, a very good friend of mine who is runs the Royal College of Art printmaking department, called Chris Orr, is retiring this summer. He's 65 and he's done a fantastic job for the last 10 years. And when he's leaving, he's putting a portfolio. There's a great tradition at the Royal College of putting portfolios of alumni and people together to raise bursaries to support the students, and he's putting his final portfolio of 10 people together. There's Peter Blake and Stephen Chambers, all sorts of people, Tracy. And I said I'd do a plate for this, and I went into the Royal College and just worked on this plate, and it came off, and I thought, God, I should be putting that in the summer show at the Academy. And it's one of those things that working in a kind of really nice environment with the students around and the beautiful etching studio there, this thing happened, and I think it's one of the best etchings I've ever did, and I've donated it to the Royal College, and so I'll get 5 copies of it. But I think that would, but I can't be specific, really. But it's again something I've done this year.
Yeah. We've got one last question, I think, over there. Thank you.
Just, when you have a piece of work which you feel is successful, what's the qualities about it that make you think that?
For me, I guess when I'm often making the work, I spend a lot of time sort of closing my eyes and thinking about that, why I drew this and why I made this piece of work. And sometimes when I finish a plate, I do the same thing. I think, sort of close my eyes, think about where I was, and look at this image, and if it evokes that sense of what I originally felt, then I think it's finished and it means something. I guess that would be for me.
And I've got no idea how to answer your question.
It's a difficult question. I think Jason's answer was spot on, actually. I think really it is that sense in which sometimes in something that is successful, it's serendipity, it's that happy accident, it's that sense in which you've captured something that maybe you weren't trying to capture, but that you were trying to capture last time, and you've done it without thinking about it, without trying to force it. It's somehow appeared, and sometimes that's serendipity, sometimes it's the process. It's magical. It does things that you don't want it to do, but you were trying to do last week.
One very quick question.
Very quick. Last
is it to capture, or is it to be captured that you do your work?
Yes or no?
Yes or no?
No idea. Round and round, bloody press.
I think I'm captured by the process itself. I think I am.
Etching is the most beautiful, always the most beautiful thing. It will never ever be anything else, and I think I've actually scratched about 10% of it.